Shalom and welcome to the European Report here in the European Parliament, in the heart of the European Union. And in today's programme, we'll be discussing the recent anti-Semitic attack on the Jewish synagogue in Germany and asking what can be done to make our streets safe in Europe for Europe's Jewish community. And in this programme, I'll be joined by Tomas Sandell, the founder and director of the European Coalition for Israel, as well as Katharina von Schnurbein, the EU's coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, and also David Lega, who's a Swedish MEP. So welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Thomas, I'll start the programme with you. It's great to have you back on the programme. In what is a very important programme. So I'm going to ask you, can you share with us your recent mission that you took on behalf of ECI in Israel in the United Nations General Assembly in New York?
Thank you, Simon. I know it's a sobering time that we are living in, so I'm happy to at least start on a quite uplifting note. Because I would say that our recent mission to the UN during the high-level week of the UNGA was unprecedented in many ways. And I think this can be shown just in a number of meetings we had for government leaders from 4 different continents, discussing how we can make the UN a more friendly place for the state of Israel. And obviously, during the time we were there, also Yom Kippur fell during this time. And as you know, since a number of years back, this is now a holiday recognized by the UN. So, but this so-called Yom Kippur Coalition that we've been busy building up over the years consisted originally of 70 nations, but now it's expanding in a very particular way. And I think it was symbolic in a way for the week that the foreign minister of Bahrain was given an award for being such a great friend of Israel and the Jewish people. And we know that at the same time, the King of Morocco is building a Jewish museum in Morocco.
Amazing.
So this is in many ways an unprecedented, perhaps it is a window of time, I don't know. But what it does, of course, is that it strengthens the position of Israel in the international arena. And we are very happy to play a little part just as a non-Jewish organization to push that process forward.
Fantastic, thank you. And David, warm welcome to the programme. It's not every day that we have a Paralympian on the programme and a world record holder. So congratulations. And
thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Old merits. It was 20 kilos ago. But,
well, you can't take the medals away. So which is wonderful. And also, you've been newly elected to the European Parliament in May. So congratulations on that. But the issue of anti-Semitism is a personal one for you, particularly what happened to your grandparents during the Second World War. Can you share with us a little short story of the plight of your grandparents, which is so typical of so many European Jews?
Yes, of course. Since the Jewish identity is so important to me because it's been with me all my life, I would say that my Jewish identity is larger than my identity as a disabled person because it affects me in so many different ways, even though I'm not religious. My grandfather was born in Jewry in Poland in 1915. And when the ghettos started, he fled to former Soviet Union, and he managed to find my grandmother there, and they married, came back to Poland after the Second World War. And then when anti-Semitism rose again in the late 1960s, they felt compelled, they were forced to flee again and fled to Sweden. And I never considered it to be so vital important. I knew we didn't have a big family because only 3 people survived, but for me, it was natural. One day that really affected me was the day that when I, as a Paralympian, published my book. I had a book release, and for him, that was the greatest moment, and I never understood that beforehand, because when the name Lega was on a book, Hitler had failed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that really moved me in a way that I didn't consider possible, because it was such a different aspect that I never considered, that someone wanted to obliterate the name. And to preserve that was the biggest success for him, which meant that he had managed to save his family.
Incredible. So thank you so much for sharing that incredible story with us, David. And Katharina, it's an absolute honour for us to have you back on this programme. It shows how important this programme is, and I know that you've won so many friends in the Jewish community for your courageous work that you've been doing on behalf of the Jewish community to combat anti-Semitism. But sadly, we see another terror attack take place on European soil, this time an attack on a Jewish synagogue in which 2 people were murdered. Could have been a lot worse had the neo-Nazi entered the synagogue and killed those 80 worshippers there to remember the most solemn day in the Jewish calendar, which is Yom Kippur. What are your thoughts on the latest terrorist attack to hit the Jewish community and also the neo-Nazi component that was the motivation behind this attack?
Yes, I think one cannot overestimate the shock that this brings to European Jewry, not just for those who were in the synagogue, but for Jews across Europe, because even secular, very secular Jews go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and a lot of them interrupted their Yom Kippur for the first time in their lives. Some synagogues say suddenly there was police everywhere outside our synagogue as a reaction to what was happening in Halle. And I think for many years to come, people will look back and say, do you remember last year? Do you remember 5 years ago? Do you remember 10 years ago? So this is something that goes very deep, and I think we have to be aware of this. Now, with regards to the threats, the terrorist threats, there has been a lot of improvement. We are taking terrorist threats from the left as from the Islamist extremists as serious as the neo-Nazi extremism and white supremacists. In a way, what we saw in the US with Pittsburgh and Poway has come here to Europe. And it is something that, as is being tackled on all different kinds of levels, but it is very difficult when it comes to these individual persons. We know that security is the number one issue, has been the number one issue for a long time for the Jewish community, and therefore we have actually acted in a lot of different levels. One has been that the declaration that the European Council adopted in December last year started with the need for an increase of security, with the commitment of all member states to increase the security of Jewish premises. We then held a meeting in June where we brought together, and in some cases even for the first time, authorities from the member states with Jewish representatives of that member state to discuss their specific security situation and to ensure that there were going to be common risk assessments, that it's not for the Jewish community to pay for their own security, but it's a responsibility of the state. So this is something that we have taken very seriously, and actually on the day, one day after the attack, we issued a letter to all member states urging them to really step up to their commitment made in the declaration, namely to secure their Jewish communities.
Excellent. Thank you for giving us an update on this situation. And, Tomas, what are your thoughts on this shocking terror attack on Europe's Jewish community? And particularly our thoughts and our prayers are with the Jewish community in Germany who are going through this fear right now. What policies do you think can be put in place that can help make the Jewish community across Europe feel much safer? And how is ECI leading this initiative?
Well, first of all, I also want to express my shock, just as my colleagues here. I think for me, what was perhaps even most disturbing, and I know I perhaps shouldn't say so, but the fact that it was a neo-Nazi attack. I perhaps have been among those who have downplayed the threat of physical violence from the extreme right. And I think statistics so far has tended to prove that point. But to see approaching the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and the end of the Shoah, to see on German soil a neo-Nazi denying the Holocaust, explaining why he did it, to say it's all the problems in the world is because of the Jews. I mean, this makes me very disturbed. And I think for me personally, it underscores the fact that we really need to look very carefully at what is happening in extreme right-wing environments in Europe. At the same time, I'm also worried that on a German government level, I don't think that this threat has been taken really seriously. And I had a discussion just in the month of June with the president of the Bundestag, where he basically dismissed any existence of anti-Semitism in Germany. And I remember how troubled I was when I was traveling back to Helsinki, and I said, you know, how can this be? And I think we have a tendency sometimes as Western intellectuals to redefine an anti-Semitic attack to being a mental disorder. So we say, well, whoever would have anything against a Jewish person and attack a Jewish person is a person with a mental disorder. So we don't name anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, as a current existential threat to our societies and to the European Jewry. And I think this should be the last wake-up call, not only for Germany, but for the whole of Europe, to see that this is still a threat. Also to add that when we put this into context, we have to look back just a few days in Berlin before the Halle attack. And we saw that there was a similar attempt to break into a synagogue, this time by a perpetrator with a different background. But nevertheless, I think what happened afterwards is quite remarkable, that he was, of course, arrested, but he wasn't charged with any offenses. So having, and I'm not going to repeat exactly what, according to media reports, he was shouting outside of the synagogue, but I think this is something where we need to much more stronger on hate speech and what is tolerable. Can we 75 years after the Holocaust, can we still publicly be out on the street and call for the killing of Jews? My answer is no.
Excellent. Very good response to that one. Thank you, Thomas. And David, if we look at statistics, during the past 3 years, Britain itself has reported the highest number of anti-Semitic instances on record. France, which has the biggest Jewish population across Western Europe, has had a 74% increase in anti-Semitic acts between 2017 and 2018. In Germany, there's been a 19% increase. Can you share with us the current situation in Sweden regarding anti-Semitism and what your government is doing to try and combat it?
Yes, of course. I would say that our government is too weak in these issues. Have been so for several years now. We measure statistics in a different way in Sweden, so it's hard to compare the measures. But I brought some numbers which are very high, and some of them are good that they're high, and some of them is really dangerous that they're high. I mean, in Sweden, 81% of people see anti-Semitism as an issue, and that is higher than the average of Europe, and that is good, naturally. And 79% of people in Sweden believe that Holocaust denial is a problem in our country, and that is also higher than the average, so that is good. But a number that is alarming is that 85% of people in Sweden say that the conflicts in the Middle East have an influence on their perception of Jews in our country. And that is also one of the highest values in Europe, which makes it dangerous as well. So the government needs to, they adopted an action plan, but they also need to implement it and make it more specific than it has been before. They have 14 key points in the action plan. 7 of them are education-based, which is, I mean, naturally it's important to see this as a long-term thing as well, but these things happen now. I'm guessing that everyone is aware of the situation in Malmö, in Sweden, where threats and attacks force Jews to abandon their homes and move elsewhere. We had in the 1970s 3,000 people living and being active in congregations in the Jewish society in Malmö. 3,000 that went down now to 380, which is a horrible number. So horrible that President Barack Obama a few years ago sent a special envoy there as well to identify the situation. So we are too weak in Sweden in these issues.
And Katharina, the Jewish community across Europe, considering the latest terrorist attack to hit European soil, which was the Jewish synagogue in Germany, there is fear and there is alarm. What message do you have for Europe's Jewish communities to kind of reassure them and to give them hope that the EU is actually bringing about positive measures that will actually protect them and give them the security that they desire?
Well, I have to say, behind all our initiatives has been the idea that we want to see a future for the Jewish community here in Europe. We want to see vibrant Jewish life. We want to see open Jewish life, and a sort of a normalization of the situation. And this has been behind all the resolutions and declarations, the adoption of the IRA definition, the initiatives on security, where we also offer member states financial support to secure places of worship, such as synagogues. So all of this gears towards that. Now, we know that all these declarations and resolutions don't help if we don't act. Absolutely. And therefore, the main issue now will be for member states to stick to the commitments they have made in all these resolutions, and to ensure that there will be police training, that there will be better data collection, so we know what's actually happening, that teachers will be trained, that curricula will be looked at, that security measures will be put in place together with the Jewish communities, all these different areas. And in the declaration, member states commit to creating a holistic strategy against anti-Semitism in the context of their general strategies against racism. And we think that by the end of 2020, hopefully all member states should have such action plans, start to put them into place. Of course, with some actions like, for example, security, they need to start immediately. And that has been the driver of the political level also of Commissioner Jourova and First Vice President Timmermans in this context, to ensure that there will be real change with the member states. And we're supporting them by regularly bringing together the member states with the Jewish community here in Brussels on specific topics. I already mentioned the one on security in June. Now we will have in December a working group meeting on education, where we will look at education of Jewish culture, because actually in our surveys, only 3% of Europeans say, I actually feel I know Jewish culture very well, which is very low. We want to show also what is possible in terms of educating about anti-Semitism and about the Shoah, of course. So we offer them instruments that are out there, best practices, things that are already happening. Nobody has to reinvent the wheel. There are action plans already in place in some countries. But what we need, I think, is this holistic approach to see what is happening in the different areas and how can we improve it and how can we learn from each other in order to ensure that really, indeed, some years down the road, these security measures will no longer be necessary because the Jewish community is safe.
Excellent. Thank you very much for giving us an update. And Thomas, here we are in Belgium, and in Belgium as well as France, we see that there are paratroopers with machine guns that are outside Jewish synagogues, outside Jewish museums, outside Jewish schools, and to enter into a Jewish school is more like a fortress. In light of that these security measures are okay in the short term, but in the long term, they don't do anything to reassure Europe's Jewish community, particularly as we see the latest terrorist attack. But the big question I have to ask is, does European Jewry have a future in Europe?
Simon, I would like to rephrase that question into asking, does Europe have a future if we lose the fight against anti-Semitism? If Jews in Europe don't feel that they have a future in Europe, does Europe have a future? The obvious answer is no. And this is why we as an organization have called upon the President-elect Ursula von der Leyen to, as the first measure, having been installed as President November 1st, to call together a crisis summit on the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And I think because this poses an existential threat to the very soul of Europe. And I think it would be a very appropriate way to start that 5-year term. Let me also then say that the very existence of European Coalition for Israel also goes back to a similar crisis summit in 2004 by then Commission President Romano Prodi. Of course, in 2004, I would have dreamt or liked to see that 16 years later, things would be different. Perhaps this is our last chance to get things right. And I can only repeat what Katharina von Schnurbein already said, the time to act is now.
Katharina, this autumn we've remembered the 80th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. This January is going to be the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. In light of this, we have record levels of anti-Semitism across Europe. Do you think that European Jewry has a future on this continent if we see the continuation of anti-Semitic terror attacks as we're seeing now?
Now, we have not denied at all the threat and also the fears that we can see among the Jewish community. We believe, and this has been said repeatedly by the leadership of the political leadership of the European Commission, that Europe without Jews doesn't have a future. So we have always argued that therefore the fight against anti-Semitism is not the responsibilities of the Jews. It's the responsibility of the institutions, of the governments, of the parliaments, of civil society to stand up for what is dear to us, namely a diverse, democratic, open society in which all different kinds of minorities can also thrive. And there is this saying, it starts with the Jews, it doesn't stop there. I think this is what we have seen. The Jewish community has been under threat for very long and for far too long. And measures are being put in place. It's not that nothing has happened, but much more needs to happen. But there are spillover effects to other communities. There are also attacks on mosques, on churches in some countries as well. So it's not limited, but it means that there is this poison is spreading throughout society. And I think one thing where we can all help to change the situation is to speak up whenever we see hatred and hateful speech against any kind of group. Yeah, because in the end, everyone has the right to and should have the right to live in Europe the way they want to live, as long as they are within the limits of the law. And so I would call upon everybody to speak up whenever, it costs a bit of civil courage, but this will in the end change society. And we will have a society where it's not about tolerance, it's about respect towards somebody who's different.
Excellent. And, David, we're seeing that today that anti-Semitism is coming from different forms, whether that is from neo-Nazi on the far right to Islamists to the far left. But what is the European Parliament doing, and what role can the European Parliament play in trying to combat anti-Semitism, but also reassure Europe's precious Jewish community?
I just want to say I totally agree with what you have said today. It's so important to see this as a whole image. It's not only about the Jews, it's about all the minorities. I believe that we need to continue our efforts, and just as Katharina said, a lot of the legislation was in place last term, and that is good. Now it's the time for implementation. That's what we need to do. And to be able to do that, we also need to have the organization that can actually make the controls and to see that everything is working. One thing that is worrying me a little bit is that the issue of anti-Semitism is spread over several different commissioners and not under one person, which doesn't have to be a good thing. It's not natural. So if 3 people watch this one thing, that you have 6 eyes, it can be that 3 people forget it as well. So it's really important to have a focus on anti-Semitism even during this term, and not only divide it. if we do one more resolution, I think that it needs to be more specific than the last one. I believe that it's time, I mean, look at BDS and look at to actually make a distinction between freedom of speech and hate speech.
Absolutely.
It's time to do that, and we need to do that.
David and Katharina and Tomas, thank you so much for being my guests on today's European Report, and thank you for all of you for what you're doing to combat the world's evil, the most evil hatred, which is anti-Semitism. And I just want to thank you for watching today's European Report here in the European Parliament. Anti-Semitism consumes society, it destroys society, and that's why it's imperative that the European Union and the EU member states do everything they can to protect Europe's Jewish community from anti-Semitism, from fear and intimidation, because without Europe's Jewish community, there can be no future for Europe. So thank you for watching today's European Report.